reprise du débat. The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'm speaking in opposition to Bill C-7, an act to amend the criminal code regarding medical assistance in dying. I'm also rising to raise the alarm and call on this government to put an immediate halt to medical assistance in dying in Canada's prisons until a full investigation and legislative amendments can take place. Mr. Speaker, I believe as a Conservative that my role is to be someone who stands athwart history yelling stop at a time when no one else is inclined to do so. History has shown us the consequences when people do not speak up in opposition to issues that may even seem overwhelmingly popular at the time. And today is one such case where years from now, we may look back at these debates and wonder how we could push forward with such radical legislation and changes to our societal values. That is why I'm speaking out today. Despite the consensus that appears to reign in this House that medical assistance in dying on demand is the way to go. And with that, I'll get into my comments. Dr. Ivan Zinger, the head of the Office of the Correctional Investigators, has released a deeply disturbing report this past June. I presume the government has had access to this report for months, but it was just tabled yesterday in the House of Commons. The correctional investigator raises some serious allegations, citing 3 cases of prisoners undergoing medical assistance in dying that raise, quote, fundamental questions of consent, choice, and dignity, unquote. His office also found serious omissions, inaccuracies, and misapplications of the law and policies surrounding medical assistance in dying. In one case, a prisoner who was terminally ill, serving a non-violent 2-year sentence, was denied parole and any opportunity to serve out his remaining days in the community. The inmate wished to explore the possibility of a compassionate parole, but being denied the opportunity to do so, sought an assisted death. Before receiving his assisted death, the prisoner repeatedly sought an opportunity to seek out an alternative to MAID in prison, and he was repeatedly denied the opportunity to do so. Therefore, he was left with what he felt was no choice but to seek out medical assistance in dying, and he was later granted that. This raises important questions on whether the government is adequately supporting Canadians, including Canadian prisoners, who are facing difficult end-of-life decisions, especially decisions where the power imbalance is so huge. In another case, a prisoner, in this case a dangerous offender, with a terminal illness, who was suicidal and suffering from mental illness, also received an assisted death. When prisoners are in a hopeless situation and disempowered, it's no surprise that they would seek an assisted death. In this case, Dr. Zinger pointed out that, quote, the decision to extend medical assistance in dying to federally sentenced individuals was made without adequate deliberation by the legislature, end quote. He's talking about us. He also claims that there is no oversight mechanism in the Canadian Correctional Services to ensure accountability or transparency for medical assistance in dying deaths in correctional institutions. Given that the above cases were restricted to those with terminal illnesses who qualified under the previous reasonably foreseeable death requirements, I find it very concerning that the government is removing this requirement without first acknowledging and investigating the serious concerns and allegations of the corrections investigator, who is actually calling for an absolute moratorium on all medical assistance in dying procedures in Canada's correctional institutions. Until such a time as we can craft legislation that protects the lives of vulnerable prisoners who are clearly making a choice under a situation of severe duress, we should clearly consider holding off or at least placing a moratorium on medical assistance in dying in Canada's prisons. This brings me to my next concern with this legislation, the need to protect the lives of vulnerable people like the disabled, the elderly, and the mentally ill. When this legislation was originally considered a few years ago, Canadians were assured by this government that the legislation would protect the vulnerable. Restrictions that were put in were meant to protect people from being unduly coerced into making a decision to seek MAID. They also exist to encourage people to seek out alternatives before seeking an assisted death. And I think everyone can sympathize with somebody nearing the end of their lives who is in intolerable pain seeking out an assisted death. But what Canadians did not expect 4 years ago was that today the government would be expanding this legislation to allow those who are not terminally ill or near death to qualify. This raises important concerns for disabled people and those with mental illnesses, because many of them are not close to death and will now be eligible to seek an assisted death. Now, the government has sort of washed their hands of responsibility for restrictions, and they've left it up to individuals to make this choice for themselves. And choice has been enshrined as the overriding principle of medical assistance in dying legislation, while little or no concern is being given to the factors that can go into those choices. Similar to the cases above that I cited in our prisons, many elderly, disabled, or mentally ill Canadians have been isolated for many months from loved ones in Canada's troubled long-term care centres. I wonder how many decisions to access MAID would not have otherwise been made had the situation in long-term care been addressed, or how many decisions to access MAID would have been made if Canada had an effective system of palliative care centres for people to live out the remaining days of their life in comfort and peace. We know from the government's own annual reporting that there is a significant number, and I say that one is even too many, of Canadians that did not have access to palliative care who received an assisted death. No Canadian should be forced to choose an assisted death without the opportunity to access palliative care. The government's annual reporting also revealed that in 2019 alone, 87 Canadians with disabilities received medical assistance in dying, but were denied access to critical disability support services. That is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Canadians with disabilities deserve better. I am concerned that every time we remove a protection on medical assistance in dying, that we are blurring the lines between an assisted death that is acceptable and constitutional and an assisted death that is not. And I don't believe, for many in this House, that there is a single assisted death case that would be unacceptable. And I challenge members to tell me what they think is unacceptable. The consensus among most parties in this House and most members seems to be that we need to affirm individual choices. And I think we can all recognize that no choice is made in a vacuum. They're made with a variety of factors, such as people's socioeconomic status, the quality of their life, their relations with family and friends, their mental state, their physical state, and the list goes on. And simply boiling down this argument to a matter of individual choice ignores the very real factors that can go into making someone make the decision to seek out medical assistance in dying. For example, do people feel that they're a burden on their family or society? Do they feel that there is no alternative to the pain that they're feeling? Are there monetary reasons at play? A recent article in Money Sense magazine was actually advising readers on how to maximize their pension and life insurance benefits if they chose to undergo medical assistance in dying. Now, where we have come in our public discourse in 4 short years is shocking to me. Given that I've outlined a number of factors in determining what factors could be behind someone's decision to seek out MAID, I would ask what provisions that the government is putting in place to ensure that people's lives are being affirmed and that they are receiving the support they deserve. The fact is that I believe the government is ignoring the very important role that social workers can play in these decisions. By limiting the decision for medical assistance in dying between a doctor and a patient, they're ignoring the fact that doctors are not always equipped to recognize situations where socioeconomic factors or other factors could be at play in the decision. And it could also, when they take away the requirement for 2 witnesses, I think it also creates a huge power imbalance where essentially only one person, the doctor and the patient, is making the decision here, and there's very little accountability. Finally, I want to raise the concerns of Dr. Leonie Herx, who is a chair at Queen's University and one of 750 doctors from across Canada who have urged the government to stop this legislation. In her words, medical assistance in dying was intended to be a last resort when all other measures had failed and someone had irremediable suffering close to end of life. Bill C-7 makes death on demand available to anyone who wants it. It's a radical shift in medicine. So, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I call on the government to heed the concerns of the 750 doctors, as well as the report from the corrections investigator, and immediately move to place new restrictions and protections on medical assistance in dying to ensure that vulnerable people are protected. We have a responsibility. Every Canadian life matters. We can't get this wrong. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaires. The honourable member